Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest and a bonus webinar in the Urban Living webinar series. Today's session is sponsored by Watson, Farley and Williams, and we'll hear more from them shortly. Today, we're going to be discussing the commercial rent moratorium extension and what it means for landlords and tenants. My name's George Sell. I'm Editor-in-Chief at International Hospitality Media, and we are an online publisher of B2B news websites for the hospitality industry, and we're also a conference and events organizer. So today's session, we're going to have around about a 45-minute panel discussion. We'd like to make it as interactive as possible, so if you do have any questions for our panelists, then you can submit them using either the Q&A or the chat function in Zoom. If you're not one of our panelists, you'll have seen that you have been automatically muted, and if you could keep yourself muted for the duration of the session, that would be great. Everybody who's registered for the session will receive a recording via email in the next couple of days. So before we get stuck in, I just wanted to show a few bullet points to give the conversation some context. So last month, the government announced that the existing measures in place to protect commercial tenants from eviction were extended to the 25th of March next year. And the government said this is to ensure that the sectors who are unable to open have enough time to come to an agreement with their landlord without the threat of eviction. And this means the moratorium will have been in place for around 2 years. Community Secretary Robert Jenrick announced that the legislation will be introduced to ring fence any outstanding unpaid rent that's built up when a business has had to remain closed during the pandemic. Landlords are expected to make allowances for the ring-fenced rent arrears from these specific periods of closure due to the pandemic and share the financial impact with their tenants. And while this has been a great help to businesses who haven't been able to open and to trade, it's been widely reported that around 14% of UK commercial tenants, including household names such as the ones you can see there, are not adhering to the government code of practice and are withholding rent while continuing to trade. So we have a fantastic panel with us today. I'm going to ask the gentlemen all to introduce themselves one by one, and you will be able to see their LinkedIn profiles in the chat if you'd like to continue the conversations with them after the session. So we'll go from left to right. Can we kick off with you, please, Robin? Welcome to you.
Thank you, George. My name is Robin Shepherd, founder of Bespoke Hotels, which is now a 20-year-old hotel management company specializing in iconic, unusual and idiosyncratic hotels in the UK. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Tony, welcome to you.
Hello, everyone, and thanks to everyone who could join us today. I'm Tony Milligan, Head of Membership Services here at the CTA, the Commercial Tenants Association. We're an organisation that supports commercial tenants across all sectors. My background is property. I'm a chartered surveyor, and I've represented the interests of commercial tenants throughout my career.
Thank you, Tony. David, over to you.
Thank you. David Sheen, I'm the Public Affairs Director at UK Hospitality. As many of you probably know, we're a trade association across the hospitality sector, covering pubs, bars, hotels, leisure attractions, campsites, pretty much the full gamut. Within the trade association, I lead on the property side and have done for about the last 3 years, and obviously that's been very intensive over the last 18 months in particular. So I coordinate with the property directors within our trade association on sort of policy and government advocacy. I'm so heavily involved in all of this.
Thanks, David. And in something of a busman's holiday, you're actually in a pub, so well done for that. Last but not least, Dev from our sponsor, Watson, Farley Williams. Welcome to you, Dev.
Thank you, George. So I'm Dev Desai. I'm a partner at Watson, Farley and Williams, and I specialise in real estate dispute resolution, particularly landlords and tenants in the hospitality and retail sectors. I'll just spend a few moments just telling you a little bit more about Watson, Farley and Williams. We're an international law firm, and as you can see from this slide, we've got some 550 lawyers across 17 offices, including London, where I'm based, and other key European and Asia Pacific cities. We pride ourselves on a strong sector focus, combining our technical excellence with deep industry knowledge across our key sectors, which are real estate, energy, and transport. Our real estate focus includes a dynamic hotels and hospitality team. We advise on acquisitions and investments, management and franchise agreements, finance, development, sales of hotels and hospitality projects, and of course related disputes throughout the world. We're advising all sorts of and levels of stakeholders, including investors, developers, brands, property owners, franchisees, funders, and consultants in really the full range of beds related operating assets, from hotels and service departments to co-living, student accommodation and care homes. Our team includes restructuring specialists and dispute resolution lawyers, such as myself, who try and work to steer our clients through commercial difficulties of the kind that we're going to be discussing today. We're led by Felicity Jones, and you'll find contact details for her and myself on the slide and our LinkedIn profiles in the chat.
Thanks, Dev. Yeah, as Dev said, the contact details are in the chat, so you can access those throughout the conversation today. Okay, so let's get started, and we'll start with you, Dev. I tried to outline the current situation with those context slides, but is there anything that we need to talk about during the course of the session that I missed off there? Just, if you could just run through those very briefly.
Yeah, sure. I suppose a little bit about the specifics of the ban. It's talked about in very broad terms about being a ban on the eviction of commercial tenants, but that's not the case. It only relates to the landlord's contractual right to terminate a business lease by forfeiture for non-payment of rent for that relevant period, being the 25th of March last year to the 25th of March next year. And so this doesn't ultimately prevent the landlord from forfeiting the lease, obviously, once that period has come to an end, and also leaves open forfeiture for other reasons, for instance, administration or some other restructuring. And we can go on and explore some of the issues arising out of the lacuna that's created by those other avenues that might be pursued, particularly given the length of the extension of the moratorium that we're now experiencing.
Thanks, Dev. So the moratorium is one of the most significant measures that the government has introduced to help businesses, particularly in hospitality, but it's not the only one. But is the government doing enough to help the sector? Robin, what's your take on that?
Well, I'm delighted to see that there's more clarity over the kicking of the can down the road with the moratorium extension, but I do think a lot more provision and intellectual effort should have gone into the public domain some time ago. We knew this was going to be a long, hard road. If you look at Germany and other civilized countries, their attempts to appease the landlord and moderate with the tenant is already well in place. And I think the fact that we're still saying, well, we'll have a bit of arbitration when we can get round to it, is a bit thin as far as I'm concerned. But then, without wishing to be too anti-Tory, I wouldn't have expected anything less from this particular motley crew of politicians.
Thank you, Robin. David, do you think there is enough help for hoteliers and other accommodation providers?
We'll not follow down the political route at this stage. I think across the piece there's been some fairly significant support across business rates, across the VAT cut that came into play last July, Ease Out to help out, and of course the furlough scheme. So I think to give the motley crew a little bit of credit, they have put in place some measures. I think there's bits missing. I think it's absolutely crazy that business rates kicked in again on the 1st of July this year, even at a discounted rate. The delays to reopening Robin sort of referenced, they've been really very unhelpful. And then we've got some of the issues around sort of international travel that still persist and are really going to be hitting a lot of hotels very hard in specific areas. And we touched briefly on it before we started, but yeah, the labour shortages particularly being exacerbated at the moment by the NHS app. So there are some real struggles at the moment, sort of outside of the property space. I know we're here to talk property, but there are some real challenges as we go into the summer. In terms of what they're doing on property, we've been quite supportive of the process they've taken. This was fairly similar to the route that we proposed to government, of the 6 options that they proposed. We proposed that they did go with options 3 and 6, which is the extension to forfeiture. We only proposed 6 months, and a binding arbitration process to be put in place. So I think it's in where we are here. I think this is the least worst option from where we could have been sort of in the spring.
Yeah, thank you, David. We saw from one of the slides earlier that there are businesses who these measures were perhaps not necessarily aimed at, who are taking advantage of them and not playing ball. But are the majority of landlords and tenants playing by the rules? Tony, what's your take on that at the CTA?
Well, I can only really speak for the tenants that come to us who have difficulties, particularly around the rent issues that they're having as a result of the pandemic, struggling to keep their businesses afloat. I would say that this affects, a number of sectors, not just the hospitality sector. I think someone mentioned tourism earlier, but there are all those supply chain businesses that are involved within the hospitality sector that haven't received that targeted support. So I think in that respect, we're a little bit disappointed that those sectors aren't receiving support as well. So we get a number of tenants who come to us because frankly they are being bullied by their landlords into paying rent when they don't actually have the funds to pay rent, or they're having to take out loans in order to service that rent. And although there's a moratorium on evictions, the landlords still retain a right to pursue tenants with debt through the court. So what we're finding is, a lot of tenants are under pressure from their landlords, either directly or through their lawyers sometimes, to pay rent, or find a way to pay rent, even though it's incredibly difficult for them and their businesses, and this is putting an immense strain on tenants. Both in commercial terms, and personally, there's a real people behind these businesses, and they're struggling. Yeah,
thank you. Robin, you mentioned before we started the call that you have 13 different landlords. Have you noticed any major differences in their approaches to the pandemic and your relationship with them?
Well, they'll remain nameless, but a couple resemble Attila the Hun in terms of their approach to our livelihood, and have behaved in a very deaf way to our pleas for some form of clemency. We have some heroes amongst landlords who've been on the front foot, collegiate and forthright, and I'm terribly grateful to them. I suppose one of the paradoxes in here is that you can have a blanket rule that says landlords and tenants will agree a pro forma catch-up payment, but if you're at the rump end of a short lease, it's terribly difficult to see how much runway you're going to have as you come out of the pandemic to be able to play catch-up. You've got new rent to pay, but you've still got this legacy of old rent that you're duty bound to pay. Now, if you've got a 25-year, 50-year plus of life expectancy on a lease, you've got a decent chance of amortizing that rent catch up over time. I don't think it's necessarily the tenant's fault that he might be 1 or 2 years from the end of an existing agreement, and then where do you go other than voluntary administration, which is a very unpleasant place to be and not something I would recommend to anyone, but I'm afraid I think it is necessary. Going back to the 14% slide that you quoted in terms of those businesses who perhaps shouldn't be doing what they're doing, I think that opens up a much bigger can of worms in terms of furlough payments and who's on true furlough, who's on amber furlough, and who's on a completely wild and wacky furlough. There's so many examples of malpractice and good practice. It's very confusing.
Deb, I see you've raised your hand. I'll come to you in a sec. I just wanted to ask Robin if you could tell us a few of the measures that your most cooperative and benevolent landlords have introduced, things to make the whole process easier for both parties.
I think first of all, having regular dialogue. As we went into lockdowns, thought we were coming out of lockdown, went back into lockdown again, there's necessarily been a number of conversations. Now, those landlords who've had dialogue, we've been able to be very transparent with them and say, here's our position, what would you like us to do? And in the majority of those cases, we've come up with a payment plan. It's been contingent in most cases on having to borrow the money, as Tony was suggesting earlier, through CBILS or some other mechanic, just to pay the rent. So we're digging ourselves even further into debt in order to dig ourselves out of the debt. But that's the way the government decided to shape this particular process. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong. It just is very hard if you're a tenant. If you're a landlord, I don't think there's been anything like enough guidance from a central source saying, this is how we would expect you to behave, and this is what we are prepared to support you with. So it's not surprising that you get some wild-ranging examples of behaviour, but good and bad.
Thanks, Robin. Deb, did you want to come in on that one?
Yes, I need to echo what Robin said about dialogue, because one thing I've noticed acting for both landlords and tenants is that engagement in terms of understanding each other's businesses and positions has been key to reaching concession arrangements and situations where Robin's described where you might be at the front and you're at the end of a lease. I've seen deals done involving re-gearing of leases, extensions in return for concessions that are agreed. So there are deals to be done there as long as there is that open and honest engagement. I suppose the other thing to note is that the courts have stepped in and there'll be other dispute resolution mechanisms to step into to help landlords and tenants come to agreements where they haven't otherwise been unable to do. The government's obviously announced, as Robin intimated earlier, an arbitration scheme. Of course, the devil will be in the detail of all of this, but essentially where parties are unable to agree to concession arrangements between them, they'll be subject to a binding arbitration process, which will impose a legally binding, what the government's called agreement, but it's not agreement if they haven't actually agreed, but it imposes a concession upon them in relation to COVID, what the government's called COVID-related rent debts. And those arrangements are currently being designed, and the idea will be that there'll be a body of specific rent arbitrators who will be delivering these agreements subject to guidelines that the government's going to be publishing. I suspect a lot of those guidelines will be inspired by the kinds of agreements that consensually are being agreed in the market at the moment.
Mm-hmm. We'll move on to those shortly, Dev, but I see David has raised his hand. Do you want to come in there, David?
Just to build on Deb's point, particularly the devil being in the detail, there's a process going on at the moment with government. We're hoping that something will get published in the next couple of weeks. We're not actually that confident it will, and it could slip into September. So we could have another 2 months of waiting for what government's planning to do. But the plan is certainly to to bolster the existing code of practice and make that a little bit, well, I think probably quite a lot more prescriptive. So that arbitration will follow quite a tight path. So that's sort of our expectation as it stands. I think it's also worth noting, actually, we've talked about moratorium extending to March, but there are, well, I think others have mentioned CCJs as an option that have been quite frustrating to see, to be honest. But the other protections, including winding up petitions and CRA, actually fall away at the end of September as it stands. We believe it's government's intention to extend those further, but that's just something to be bearing in mind. I'm sorry, my final point here, which I meant to make earlier, I have a lot of sympathy for a lot of the landlords that have been put in positions where they've had tenants that probably have traded okay during this period and haven't paid any rent. So just to balance it up, that it isn't a one-way street, but certainly from a hospitality perspective, and even including one of the businesses on that slide who has traded to some extent but hasn't traded anywhere near the full extent is with their indoor trading facilities closed, and it has been very, very tough.
Thank you. Dev, in the cases where landlords and tenants have been able to reach a deal, can you give us a few good examples of the ways both parties have worked together to achieve an agreement?
So those are, in some cases, as I say, the leases have been re-geared. It might make sense for the tenant and the landlord for instance, the lease to be extended by a certain number of years in return for some kind of concession, or the rent is abated and then repaid, from a later date over a negotiated period of time. That's the kind of thing I have in mind. One thing I think we should bear in mind is the discussion is often around, of course, the tenant's business and what the tenant's business needs are, which is completely understandable because it's the party trading from the premises. But of course, the landlord doesn't operate in a lacuna either. It is itself a business. It may be, a pension fund that has to be paying out to the very pensioners that are the most impacted by the COVID crisis. So the most successful deals I've seen are done where actually there's a mutual respect there and both parties actually understand each other's businesses, not just one way around.
And presumably in a lot of cases, landlords have mortgages on the property. Yes. How are the banks treating landlords who have mortgages and who have tenants who are unable to pay rent? Are they being broadly sympathetic?
So it might experience it is something of a mixed bag in terms of the approach the banks are taking. Where it's a residential mortgage of a house, I'm generally finding that the banks are being very sympathetic. But commercial leases, portfolios of properties, and so on, I think less so, generally speaking.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Dev, I think when we spoke beforehand, you wanted to touch on the impact of CVAs and other restructuring measures. What are the options for a tenant who feels like they've reached the end of the road, and what should they consider if they get to that stage?
So, of course, everyone immediately jumps to the typical insolvency regimes, administration, liquidation, and so on. But of course, there are CVAs and other statutory restructuring approaches that have been taken successfully by a plethora of companies. And one thing that I've noticed in relation to those is it's a similar, somewhat cynical sometimes in terms of how CVAs are used. CVAs are company voluntary arrangements where a company effectively via 75% of creditors by value compromises its debts, typically landlord rents, say across a retail portfolio, for example. But one thing I have noticed in the hotel sector and others is that there's a competitive pressure once one or two players in the market enter into a CVA, because of course, if they're having their rents reduced by say 25%, well, now they are a competitive advantage to a hotelier, say, that hasn't entered into a CVA. So it's a kind of downward spiral of insolvency related regimes that are happening, which of course is not a healthy approach. But I think, and those reductions are then essentially, if they pass through the voting process, imposed on the landlords. And so landlords shouldn't necessarily, or quite apart from all these protections, there is somewhat of a nuclear options out there that can essentially forcibly compromise the rents, even before we get to this arbitration scheme.
Mm-hmm. Tony, talking of the arbitration scheme, what is your understanding of the timescales for this? And we've actually had a question in from Andrew Shaw, who's asking when we can expect to have clarity on the arbitration scheme. Is there a government announcement imminent?
Sure. The fact of the matter is we don't know precisely. All we know from government is that they intend to introduce the new scheme within this parliamentary session, which I think probably will run up until April, May next year. So it would be helpful if we had some guidance from the government, and I think we probably need that quite urgently now, to understand the nuts and bolts of the scheme and how it's going to work, who's going to implement it, how are we going to recruit the vast numbers of arbitrators, because I think that's what we've settled on, in terms of deciding the disputes, and what sort of framework are we going to work towards. So there's an awful lot of questions that remain outstanding here, and we're very keen to work with government to understand how the bill is going to be posed, how it's going to be introduced, and how it runs its course through Parliament and ultimately becomes law. We're hoping that things will move swiftly, and we would certainly encourage government to get a move on.
So as it stands, the details are pretty thin on the ground. We don't know a great deal about it.
Absolutely, yeah. We don't know any details. We're quite concerned that we don't know anything at this stage, because it's a massive change. We're talking about changes that affect contract law. It's quite serious stuff, and to implement these changes, we're going to need professionals that know what they're doing. And we're a little bit worried, as to how that's going to work in practice.
Okay.
I agree with Tony that I think we should manage our expectations about this arbitration scheme, both in its design and efficacy. And for instance, what rents would it apply to? The government's talked about, COVID affected rents. If it's just for periods where there's been a national lockdown or a closure, that's obviously a very finite period of time that's already essentially passed. Or will it apply to a broader period of time where a tenant business is otherwise affected by, social distancing measures, low footfall, and so on? Be interesting to see what the government has in mind, but I'm not holding my breath.
Okay, thanks, Steph. Robin, what opportunity do you think the crisis has presented to the hospitality sector to learn and improve the way they do things going forward, in terms of a more equitable and collaborative approach between landlords and tenants?
Well, I think, if David doesn't mind me patronising his organisation slightly, what is a wonderful benefit of what's happened is that UK hospitality has absolutely stood up to the mark and said, we will be a clear, erudite voice on behalf of the industry. We'll give you speed, acumen and verve. And they've delivered spectacularly in all those levels. And as chairman of one of the also runs, I used to head up the Institute of Hospitality, and I'm very happy to be in the slipstream watching the turbocharge go past, because it was so refreshing to see that skilled and dexterous ability jousting with Parliament and lobbying. So that's one of the side benefits. On a more philosophical and practical level, within the nature of agreements going forward, I do feel that the historic upward only rent review 3 months in advance, send me a bottle of claret at Christmas time kind of relationship should really be consigned to the bin. The splitting of OpCo and PropCo, absolutely, I don't think is where the smart money should be going forward. And I think we've certainly seen a number of landlords who would have historically insisted upon a lease from us now saying we'd much rather have a management contract. But I think, going back to that word dialogue, provided you have an agreement in place where there's mutual respect between the landlord and the tenant, and you're both trying to do the best you can to drive the profit and create a sustainable business, then you're going to have a successful formula. The issue is when that's so disconnected and fragmented as it has been, and how do you repair all that damage? I'm not sure there's an easy answer. It's going to need an awful lot of glue to put it all back together again on a Humpty Dumpty basis.
Mm-hmm. We saw in the retail sector an awful lot of performance related leases, and there have been some in hospitality, I think more on the F&B side. Is that something that you've seen across your business, or you think are a good thing?
I absolutely believe in it. I think the hybrid, whereby there is a de minimis rent, which is manageable in inverted commas as a base, and then a percentage of turnover or percentage of profit where there's a top up, so the landlord benefits for super performance. I think that should be here to stay. The problem is, of course, when you're gearing, anybody who wants to put debt against a business needs to secure tenant with a big warrant sitting behind their brand name, Whitbread being a classic example. And then they can gear up that rent as secure and Bank of England stuff, whereas us mere mortals don't quite have that advantage, and we're having to do deals on a completely different yield as a result. I think it's been a very rude awakening. It's been a very harsh lesson for us all, but I'm optimistic that, government interference or not, some good will come out of this process.
Let's hope so. David, would you like to pick up on that and talk about perhaps what the industry can learn and implement in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thank you to Robin, those very kind words. Very dynamic chief executive in place who drives us all forward. So that's been useful. I think probably almost the first thing that Robin said was the dialogue and collaboration. I'm not sure they've quite been learned fully from this, but I think they are the answers out of this. I think the real pains have been around the edges, as others have mentioned it. That's been where you've got the really difficult situations where people aren't having those conversations, aren't prepared to look at each other's businesses and work out where mutual survival actually lasts. And so hopefully that is something that does come. Government has committed to reform of the landlord-tenant relationship later this autumn. I think that again potentially has some benefits. I think the landlord community also thinks it has some benefits. So it'll be quite interesting to see what comes out of that. So I think that's something that's been sort of called for years and years and years. And I know Robin's mentioned some of those upward-only rent review elements that are part of that. Yeah, I don't know whether it will be delivered, but probably the need for greater resilience in the sector. We all got hit pretty hard, and I don't know how you can come from the position where we are. We've been knocked so far back to then build up that resilience. But I think that's something that we need to strive for. I think that's probably well, actually, sorry. The one other thing that I think government has looked at business rates and gone, that's really not fit for purpose, and reform is totally necessary there, and needs to more fairly represent trading conditions on high streets and in the wider communities. And I think I think that will be a positive that comes out of this, but I might be clutching at straws.
We've talked a lot about the structure of businesses and what business specific help is available, but it was mentioned earlier that this whole situation is not just affecting people's businesses, it's affecting people themselves. What help is available to people in the hospitality industry on a personal level, you know, in terms of people to speak to, people to give advice? Is there enough out there, and if so, where should people be looking for that sort of thing?
Robin may actually be better placed. I know some of the trade charities have done some great stuff over the past 18 months. I probably know licensed trade charity better than others, but I know there's been a huge amount going on, and actually that's probably another thing that should probably be recognised. There's been a really collaborative spirit amongst the sector, and people helping each other out. I'll probably defer to Robin and Tony at that point.
Yeah, Tony, do you want to jump in first on that one? Then I'll come to you, Robin.
Yeah, sure. You know, it was just a quick point, really. You know, just acknowledging what David said, and also Robin. You know, we've gone through an extraordinary period of change in the last however many months since the pandemic began, and I think this has crystallised change that has kind of been on the horizon for a while. So I think it's exciting times for tenants, both in hospitality and other sectors, but it's also very difficult and challenging times as well. And going back to that personal element, the nature of your original question, you know, certainly at the CTA we can provide support for tenants in all sorts of areas. So you know, we work quite closely with other partners, and we're certainly looking to partner with organisations that can help on personal levels in terms of mental health.
Thanks. And Robin, have you got any words of advice for people here who might be struggling?
I'll talk to people, your peer group, anybody who'll listen, and see if you can get some comfort from them. But I think if you're in public office where you have a pension and you have a level of certainty about the job that you have, and then you transfer that into the mindset of someone in a private business with the many variables that are in place at the moment, it's terribly difficult to understand the mentality of the natural entrepreneur, because if you overthink it, you're going to be petrified about the supply chain failing you, the labour supply chain failing you, lack of control over rents and rates. There's an awful lot of stuff that you cannot affect and is happening to you. So you do need to take comfort in the brave person who says, oh, I can sort it all myself, I'm Superman, really is very foolish. I think you have to set up networks, and you have to be, to quote the sort of modern Gareth Southgate now, it's the compassionate gentleman. Sorry to bring a football reference in, but there we are. We were robbed. More seriously, I'd love to see a greater acceptance that men should talk, and we should need that often to be facilitated by ladies, and we need to have a session where it's quite natural to share your concerns and just get it out, and not necessarily seek answers, but just to express how you're feeling and what your deepest concerns are. Just to finish off with the sermon, we're fortunate in having a head of personnel who's particularly sharp at this sort of thing within our own company, and we've run something as banal as quizzes as we went into lockdown to begin with, to keep the teams occupied and foster a spirit of kindredness, right the way through to full mental health workshops to see what can be done for those particular members of staff who appear on the surface to be struggling much more than others, and comes back to lots of dialogue and lots of talking.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. Dev, I know from personal experience having to postpone some of the fantastic events that we've got planned numerous times, that this has gone on a lot longer than any of us expected. Do you think there is a chance that the moratorium may have to be extended again, particularly if the arbitration scheme is swamped? when it's opened?
I suspect that the government had set, a 9-month extension of the moratorium with a view that hopefully that would be the last of those extensions, because previously it's done iterations of about 3 months extensions. The last couple of those has always been termed the final extension, and obviously it has not turned out that way. And frankly, the government doesn't know how matters will unfold, how the COVID virus might mutate, or what circumstances might arise. And I know certain of my clients in the hospitality space were concerned actually by the 9-month extension, because they thought, well, does that mean that the social distancing and other trading restrictions will be extended or cancelled and reintroduced? And I think that is, inevitably a possibility. If in addition to infections, hospitalizations and deaths increase, I think that's probably the key measure the government's likely using to decide what restrictions might need to be reintroduced. So we're not over it yet, that's for sure.
Yeah, thanks. David, did you want to come in there?
Just to be slightly more optimistic, well, optimistic and pessimistic about the government. That I think they genuinely had to buy themselves time. They knew that this process would take a long time to bring in the arbitration, and that's my personal and professional hope that that's the reason it's this length, and it's not because they expect further lockdowns, but it is clearly a possibility. And probably to round back to the point Robin made earlier, actually hopefully this time round they can make the system a bit more sophisticated, not just have 3-month can kicking sessions, but actually you bring in you ring fence that you have a sharper system that works more effectively. Again, possibly wishful thinking, but I think they'll try and be more sophisticated this time around.
I think one aspect of the lack of sophistication of this extension is, a product of its length, is that those landlords that might not have taken, say, debt court proceedings or obtain a county court judgment against the party on the basis that the lifting of the moratorium might have brought the tenant to the table to negotiate a deal when they otherwise weren't prepared to do so. Well, a 9-month extension and the tenant essentially saying, right, well, we're not negotiating now because we've got this moratorium, might drive certain landlords to take more severe legal action when otherwise they've been patiently awaiting a change in their negotiating circumstances. So a perverse effect of the moratorium might be an escalation and increase of the disputes that haven't been capable of resolution thus far.
Yeah, thank you, Dev. Let's be optimists and let's look forward, and let's assume that well, we know deaths are down. Let's assume that the vaccination rollout is pretty much complete and case numbers start coming down and we get to some sort of normality next year. Robin, what do you think will be the biggest potential consequences of the pandemic for how you operate your business and the broader hospitality industry? What do you think will be the main changes that will have come in?
Well, forgive me, George, but I find it difficult to separate COVID from Brexit in my answer, because the two forces, when combined, have been pretty lethal. We've got a huge amount of uncertainty in terms of businesses' capacity to service rent. We've got just as much nervousness about our capacity to have enough staff in order to be open often enough to generate the income. So there's a real double-edged sword there at the moment. But I think some of the positives to come out of this will be that there'll be more of a dialogue, there'll be much more inspection of how we mitigate this happening in the future, because undoubtedly there will be some other international hiatus that none of us can predict in the future. I'm hoping that finally we will have something in law for insurance companies to provide both landlord and tenant that sits somewhere between force majeure and business interruption. I don't think it's been I don't think it's been built yet, but there must be a new COVID clause or COVID etc. clause, which could sit in there, and then the need for arbitration will be much less because we're paying to insure against such a thing happening again. So that's my hope. I have little evidence of it yet, but I trust it may come.
Tony,
just sorry to interrupt you, just on that, the Supreme Court did come to the rescue of policyholders in relation to business interruption insurance, and broadly speaking, determined the case against the insurers that business interruption insurance did bite in relation to the COVID crisis in the vast majority of cases. And they looked at 23 sample clauses in various business interruption insurance policies. So there has been that helpful development.
Dev, I think that's great news. My nervousness is what happens in practical terms, because whilst there may be the judgment, forcing or giving teeth to that, the binding part of discharging the duties of the insurers is an entirely different piece of work.
That's true. I mean, I'm representing a number of tenants and other interested parties pursuing insurers in relation to the business interruption, and I agree it can be a battle, but it's one where you've got court backing to win eventually.
David, you look like you might be about to jump in there.
Just on insurance, our experience is still it's an absolute minority of hospitality businesses that have got anywhere with insurance. I know there were the 23 cases, but they were the most blatant, weren't they, that went to court. Those were the ones that looked pretty slam dunk.
No, they looked at, they weren't, they were just clauses, the sample clauses that they, across a variety of different claimants. So it's knotty because the court looked at those in a great deal of detail. So, you know, insurers inevitably will try and find loopholes in those, but between the High Court and the Supreme Court together, they've sealed as many of those as possible. So there are good avenues through to getting that insurance, but it is a challenge because you've got to go to lawyers and it takes time to take on the insurers.
It is difficult out there. It's very tough out there, evidently. Just before we wrap up, Tony, would you like to give us maybe your take on how the pandemic will change landlord-tenant relationships in the future? Any permanent changes, structural changes that will come in as a result of this?
Sure. I mean, I think as I alluded earlier, I think that it's been an extraordinary period, hasn't it? So I think it's brought a lot of focus on landlord and tenant relationships generally, which perhaps the industry hasn't always had. I think we've always felt that the industry is a bit biased towards landlords. I think tenants are finally being able to have their say and be heard with the support of the government, which has been fantastic. I can't remember which one of the panelists mentioned changes to the Landlord and Tenant Act. I think, you know, that's certainly on the horizon. So we're expecting some announcement to be made on that towards the end of the year. But, you know, let's wait and see what happens with that. But I certainly feel that some landlords are having to change their attitude towards tenants generally. And we're seeing that with some of the major landlords, like Hammerson, certainly in the retail sphere, are starting to look at leases and have a look at what's fair in terms of, you know, the rents that tenants pay and how those rents are structured. Lease lengths are falling back, you know, and generally, I think we're starting to see at least the signs of improvement in that relationship, and tenants are gradually strengthening their negotiation position as a result of the pandemic. So yeah, I think the outlook's good for tenants. You know, I think we can see a better relationship going forwards between landlords and tenants now.
Great, thank you, Tony. we are coming to the end of our time, so I just want to run through a few quick slides before we sign off. Thanks everyone for your contributions. It was a really good discussion, I think. Yeah, there we go. So we have one last session in the Urban Living series, which is taking place on July the 21st, and this one is sponsored by Yardi, and it's about the evolution of mixed-use developments. And if you'd like to sign up for that, the link is in the chat. So this webinar series, we've put them on in the run-up to the Urban Living Festival, which is one of the events I alluded to earlier, which we've had to postpone a couple of times, but we are very confident that we will be seeing lots of you at Tobacco Dock in London on October the 26th and the 27th. Again, the details are in the chat. We have got a fantastic group of sponsors, media partners and speakers coming to the event. And if you'd like to know more or to join the ranks of them, then you can contact my colleague Katie, whose details will be in the chat now. One of the things we've had to do over the pandemic as an events business is do a great deal of online stuff, including these webinars, which we have really enjoyed. And we're just going to play you a very quick video just to give you a summary and a flavour of how they've gone.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Well, good afternoon. Hello, everybody.
And welcome to the Trailblazer
Service Department News
Rockstars
Urban Living Light
Engage.
Urban Living webinar series.
I think you have to tell the right story to the right people via the right people is really, really key in the right place.
Because we are all in the same, in the same boat. We want to make this work.
When you take away that personal contact, it's a problem.
Through the concept development, through the architecture, through the design, through the experience.
So although it's a growing sector, there's still huge scope for it to evolve even further.
Okay, as I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in getting involved in any of the webinar series or the Urban Living Festival, please contact Katie. We are across all the social media channels. We're pretty active and pretty engaged, so give us a follow on those and we can continue the conversation there. Just leaves me to say thank you ever so much to Robin, to Dev, to Tony and to David for their input today. I think it's been a great session. Thank you to Watson, Farley and Williams for sponsoring. We're going to leave the session and the chat open for a couple of minutes because there's quite a lot of info in the chat. So if you want to make any notes or take any information down from there, we'll leave the session open. Enjoy the rest of your day and hope to see you all on another webinar soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.